When I was 13, I had a gorgeous cat named Fudge. Fudge's favorite game to play was hide and seek. One night, I was playing hide and seek with Fudge when my mom said that it was time for me to go to bed. I managed to persuade her to let me finish the game. I looked all over the first floor and I couldn't find him. Finally, Mom said it was time to go to bed and that he'd come out eventually. I went up to my bed on the second floor and got comfortable. After trying to sleep with no success, I started to read as that always helps me drift off. Now at this point, I must have been reading for about half an hour, when all of a sudden, I hear a sneeze. Now at first I thought it was just Fudge, as he liked to hide under my bed, but then it happened again, so being paranoid, I froze, but I managed to muster up the courage to look under my bed. What lay among my things was a man with crazy in his eyes. From what I could tell, he had a beard, and he had a cross tattooed on his naked chest. The man had a smile plastered on his face that I can only best describe as the smile the Joker wears. I freaked out and ran screaming bloody murder downstairs to where my mom sat on the red leather sofa. At this point, I was screaming, crying, and in the middle of having a panic attack. My mom called me down, gave me her phone to call 999, and being the badass she was, ran into the kitchen to get a knife, and then proceeded to run up the stairs, knife in hand. She came down after being there for about 2 minutes and said that the window was wide open and that no one was there anymore. Within about a minute of my mom being back downstairs, the police arrived and immediately began to search the room. The man got away, but what the police found in my room, something that I did not know about until I was 18, still haunts me to this day. As they searched my room, the police found a cleaver and rope under my bed. I still wonder how long he had been there, but I am so grateful he sneezed, because if he hadn't, I wouldn't be here to share this story with you. So scary crazy guy who hid under my bed with intent to harm me, let's never meet again. I was about 16 and for the first time driving on my own. On this night, I was leaving my Taekwondo center where I practiced at every night until 8 p.m. It was about a 20-minute drive home, and it was already pitch black outside since it was the middle of winter. I noticed a car parked near me, leaving at the same time and thinking nothing of it. However, a minute or so in, I noticed that they were taking all the same turns as me. I still didn't think much of it, even though I took a lot of turns. I simply made a mental note. About 15 minutes later, after I had gotten on and off the freeway and was making more specific turns, the car was still there. I began to panic as I was nearing my subdivision, and if this person really was following me, I knew that I didn't want to show him or her where I lived. I entered the subdivision and decided to make turns that didn't make any sense, like taking streets that would circle back on themselves. Watching intently from the rearview mirror, my stomach sank when I watched him follow me on each and every turn. I tried to speed up and make random turns through the subdivision. Thankfully, it was a pretty big and intricate subdivision. But I was also afraid of going too fast in a subdivision at night. I mean, what if a kid ran out in front of me? I was panicking all around and picked up my old clunker of a cell phone to call my stepdad to see if he could meet me outside, but the phone was dead. I hit the gas, made a quick right turn around the corner, and an immediate left into a cul-de-sac area before I could see his headlights followed. I pulled into a driveway, hiding my car to the right of a pickup truck so it wouldn't be visible from the road, and I cut the lights. My pursuer continued on past the cul-de-sac. Shaking, I pulled out and went back the way I came to get to my house unseen. My biggest weakness during this point in my life was my sense of direction. I couldn't remember how to get anywhere around town, and I constantly had printouts from MapQuest in my passenger seat. I actually had no idea where I was in the damn neighborhood. So I set out in the direction I thought my house was, but after a minute or so, I ended up at another cul-de-sac and started making a U-turn. As I start to pull around, I see a car coming my way. It was my friend, again pulling through the narrow part of the entrance, with parked cars on either side of him, making him look impossible to pass. That's when I saw him roll down his window and start yelling something. At this point, my headlights were directly on his face, and 10 years later, I still remember it in great detail. He looked insane. His eyes were bulging, his balding hair looked damp with sweat or grease, and he wasn't wearing a shirt. Thinking back on it, I have no idea if he was completely naked. I just assumed he was only shirtless, since I lived in the South, and that was not a strange sight, honestly. He looked thin, unhealthy, and he was screaming with everything he had out his open window while shaking all over, body clamped down on the steering wheel. In total shock and no idea what to do in this blocked-in area, I opened my sunroof slightly to hear him. "Your tail light is out!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Your tail light, it's out!" He screeched the last word, making it sound like my taillight had caused him physical harm. WTF. Did this guy just follow me across town at night to tell me, a lone female in a car, that my taillight was out? Who the hell does that? Who the hell keeps searching in a neighborhood for me after I managed to dodge them? This was just not okay. This kept going on until a porch light to my right flickered and the door opened. "What's going on out here?" a man yelled from his doorstep. My wide, crazy-eyed follower looked at the man and started moving his car forward, leaving me an opening. I gunned it. At this point, I was on autopilot because somehow I guided myself perfectly home, even though I honestly don't remember doing it. I pulled into the driveway and, afraid that the man was still somewhere out there, locked my doors, and laid on the horn until my mom and stepdad came out. The cops were called, and my stepdad sat out in the driveway while my mom brought me inside. He didn't tell me this that night, but a few years later he disclosed that he did see the car from my description pass by the house. Slowly. Stepdad was able to get a partial license plate number, but nothing else came of it. So, overly helpful, crazy-eyed man, let's not meet again. But if any of you are wondering, yep, my left taillight was indeed out. This happened to me last year on my birthday. I invited a few friends to sleep in my 6-man tent. As I was setting up the tent, my dad came into the garden and told my friends and I to be careful, as he had seen a shady-looking man in a baseball cap walking slowly up and down my street like he was checking out my house. It was about 1 a.m. when my friends and I were sitting on my patio at the table and talking about random stuff, when I heard rustling in my neighbor's garden. I didn't find this too unusual because it was the summer and I lived in a rural area of the UK where we had hedgehogs living nearby. But then, I noticed the shape of someone's body emerging from the bush. It was a man in a baseball cap. One of my friends asked what he was doing there, but there was no answer. We asked again, and he chuckled and left through my neighbor's gate. By 4 a.m., most of my friends had fallen asleep. My slightly older friend and I were whispering to each other as we were trying not to wake everyone else. I heard my neighbor's fence rattle as if someone had hopped over, but a few seconds later, we saw a figure move past the window of the tent. I could barely make it out, but I distinctly remember seeing a hat in the moonlit window. He went around to the back of the tent, so I decided to wake everyone up and run back inside my house and into the living room. A good half an hour passed when I heard the police sirens outside. This didn't seem possible, as my mom was asleep and my dad worked nights. I looked outside to see 3 police officers in my garden where the tent was, and my neighbor talking to another officer. After a few minutes of watching through my back door window, the police walked out of my garden with a man in his early 40s in handcuffs. I saw my neighbor, and he gestured for me to come outside. My friends followed behind me, and we spoke to him. My neighbor is in his late 80s and lives alone. He said that he was getting a glass of water from his kitchen when he saw his security light turn on in his garden. He quickly glanced over and saw a man hop over his fence and into my garden. He then called the police, and they said they would come over. After telling me this, a police officer walked over and informed me that the man they arrested was a burglar who had broken into multiple homes in the local area. What he said next still makes me shiver. They said they found him crouched down in the corner of the tent with a large knife. The officer then advised me and my friends to get our stuff and sleep in the living room. By this time, my mom had been woken up by all the commotion, and she had been given the same information. She called my dad and told him what happened. I don't think I will ever sleep in a tent again. My friends always say that if something unlucky is going to happen, that it will most likely happen to me. They also say that if a creeper is around, I will end up being the one creeped on. Both of these statements are unfortunately true. I've been stalked multiple times, some ending pretty badly, and I have the worst luck imaginable. This story happened 3 years ago, and I still have nightmares about it. My mother came to stay with me for a week, which I knew would be a nightmare. We can hardly stand to be in the same room as one another, so fighting is inevitable. On her 5th night here, we got into a heated debate about religion, and it somehow turned into a full-out screaming match. About an hour into the screaming, my apartment manager knocked on the door. Before I could even apologize, my mother jumps in and says that I had been threatening her. I was so shocked and appalled that it threw me into a mini panic attack. I grabbed my keys from the key rack by the door and took off. It wasn't the wisest thing to do, I know, but I was so frazzled that I didn't know what else to do. I ended up sobbing my eyes out and just driving. This went on and off for about an hour and 70 miles. Driving has always calmed me down, so even after the tears subsided, I kept going. About another hour later, I saw an exit for a dam, which surprised me. I had lived here for 2 years and I had no idea there was a dam anywhere close. I decided to go take a look, even though it was 3 a.m. and pitch black. I still wasn't ready to head back, and this seemed like a good distraction. It was another 30 miles on a desolate road before I finally reached the dam. It was hard to miss because it was the only light I had seen for 30 miles. I crossed the dam and saw that there were a couple turns leading to campsites. At this point, I realized that there was a legit lake. Yeah, I know, dam equals lake, but I didn't really put the two together. I decided to flip around and go back to a little parking area I had seen near the dam. Once there, I parked, and my night took a turn for the terrifying. I parked and proceeded to make one idiotic move after another. I rolled down my windows and could hear the sound of water hitting ashore, but in the light of my headlights, I couldn't see where it was coming from. The mosquitoes were pretty bad, so I rolled my window back up and started fishing around in my back seat for a flashlight that I knew I had somewhere in the car. Then, I remembered that I had it in my trunk. Now, for what happens next, please feel free to label me an idiot. I surely am. I popped the trunk, turned off my car, opened the door, stepped out, closed the door, got the flashlight, closed the trunk, went back to the door, and it was locked. My doors unlock when you open them, so I have no idea how the door became locked again, but it was. And, like the moron that I am, I still had the key in the ignition. I knew the door would have remained unlocked, so I hadn't really thought about taking the key. Instantly, tears started to well up because I knew I hadn't even bothered taking my phone with me. I panicked for a while, but then I remembered the campsites I had seen, and I hoped that maybe someone would be in one and that they would have a phone I could borrow. I started walking and fretting about waking some poor stranger in the middle of the night, but I didn't see any other options. Each campsite I came to was completely empty. I think I checked 15 or so before I started to get nervous about how far I was wandering from my car. I think I had to have walked about a mile or so, and on the walk back, my battery started to fade on the flashlight. I was only about halfway back and my panic reached a whole new level. For whatever reason, the parking area and my car seemed like a safe haven, and I started sprinting. Remember what I said about being a moron with bad luck? In my panic and in the darkness, I got switched around somewhere and ended up in a dead-end campsite, even though I could have sworn that I was still on the main road. This is when the major tears started. I panicked even more and ended up in yet another campsite. It felt like I was just getting more and more lost and I couldn't hear the water anymore, so I calmed myself down and decided to stay put until morning, which I knew wasn't too far away. I sat down, wrapped my arms around my legs, and proceeded to try rocking myself into calmness. It worked pretty well, until I saw him. I had my eyes closed as I rocked, but then I heard a dull footstep. I looked up, obviously startled, and saw him standing only a few feet away. He was massive, probably about 6'4" and had a large but not fat build, like a football player or something. In hindsight, it's amazing that I hadn't heard him approaching sooner, or smelled him. For a second, all I could do was stare in horror and gasp out incomprehensible words. Then I screamed. It only took him a second to cross the distance between us, but I didn't even have time to properly get up before he had his hand around my throat, choking me. For reference, I'm not particularly big. 5'3", 132 pounds, not skinny, but not fat either. To him, I was nothing more than a little rag doll. I wasn't even sure of what was happening, but I was being jerked around by the neck and arm. His hands were huge, and every place he grasped and pulled felt like he would snap something. When the movement stopped, I was in his lap with my head pressed against his chest, and one of his legs partially crossed over me. He was half cradling me, half grappling me. I was too dazed to make a sound, but when I tried, his hand would tighten over my throat. I went still for a few moments, but then I felt his tongue against my throat. He smelled rancid, like beer and something decomposing. I struggled to get free, but this time he pinched my esophagus between his thumb and forefinger. It was light at first, but then he started increasing the pressure. By the time he was done, I felt like I was going to pass out. I don't want to go into too much detail, because the memory is still hard to revisit, but he went back to licking, groping, and kissing. It was traumatizing, but he never went for anything too intimate. I gave up on trying to scream or get away, but he would still occasionally choke me. I sat there and simply sobbed. Then, possibly even more disturbing, he started to hum and rock me. I'm not sure why this part bothered me so much, but it did. His voice seemed higher than it should be, and his hum was rather nasally. I don't know how to describe it. Then, just as his humming was beginning to sound frantic, I saw headlights and he stopped. Somewhere in the distance, it looked as if a car was heading our way. He also saw it, and I felt panic well up inside of me, worried that he would drag me off somewhere, but he didn't. He simply let me go, stood up, and walked the opposite way into the trees. Without him supporting me, I fell back slightly and watched him walk off. The sun wasn't fully up yet, but there was enough light to make out more of him than I had been able to before. He looked as bad as he smelled. Dirty, saggy jeans, a white hoodie that was so stained that it looked brownish gray, and medium-length brown matted hair. I didn't see his face at all because I had kept my eyes shut for the entire time he had me. I could hear the car closer and I stood up. About 30 feet away was my flashlight and the place I had been sitting. I realized how far he had taken me while he pulled me around like a doll. I could see the car lights through the trees. But then they suddenly took a left turn and panic set in again. I worried that he would come back if he saw that the car wasn't coming to this campsite. I started to run. I didn't even care about staying on a path or road, just as long as I could still see the car. I caught myself on a few bushes and scraped myself falling a few times, but the pain didn't even register. I was too desperate to care. It felt like forever, and I don't know how long I actually ran, but I eventually ended up close enough to the car that the couple inside noticed me. They stopped and the guy got out. I remember not even being able to talk. For a long time, I was just shrieking at the poor guy. Even before I could tell them what happened, his girlfriend had called the police. Everything after that seems like a blur. The couple drove to the parking area, as told to do by the cops, just in case the man was still around. The sheriff's department showed up, took my statement, took me to the nearest station, asked for another statement, checked me for evidence, called my mother, and contacted the fire department to break into my car. Just as my mom and friend arrived at the station, a sheriff's car pulled up, and in the back seat was the man. I was promptly pulled back inside and asked to make positive identification. It wasn't like in the movies though. They literally just brought him up to me and asked, "Is this him?" Now, this part still leaves me extremely emotionally confused, but it is what it is. As I looked up at him, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked ashamed, confused, and oddly vulnerable. And then his eyes started to tear up. I knew something had to be wrong with him, mentally, and in a weird way, I actually felt some sympathy for him. I did confirm that it was him, but afterwards, I actually worried enough about him that I asked what would happen to him. This is where sympathy flew out the window. He was indeed mentally unstable, and as I found out, he was also a convicted sex offender. Yeah, I actually lucked out with what little happened to me. Looking back, it seems more like a dream. My mother and friend took me back to my car, and rather than being stuck in a car with my mom, I opted to let her drive my car back, and I rode with my friend. The entire drive back, she kept drilling me for more information, but I couldn't bring myself to even talk about it. I still don't like talking about it, and I refuse to ever go camping again. I'm also extremely paranoid about always having my keys on me when I step out of my car. Not a funny, haha kind of paranoid, but literally, it's now a compulsion to check to make sure I have my key with me. I usually have to check 3 times to be satisfied. As far as the guy goes, he was admitted into a psychiatric hospital, and I hope he remains there.